Questions most often asked about Louis Kelso's second income plan. Question 1. Would the second income plan cause inflation? No, it is designed to avoid inflation. Its tendency would be to stabilize and eventually reduce prices, and permit competitive setting of wages without loss of income to the worker. It is the one income economy we now have that is inherently inflationary. Remember that the familiar devices we use to artificially create employment, public works, not sought for their own sake, but for the employment they create. Agricultural and industrial subsidies, production of military overkill, crash space race programs, production of goods to give away to foreign nations all produce non-economic goods. That is, goods that create purchasing power within our economy, but that add no consumer goods and services within the economy to absorb such purchasing power. Similarly, each time wage costs are increased in order, by one means or another, to distribute more income welfare to workers without increasing, in fact, usually decreasing their work input into the economy, the cost of the product is increased. But neither its quantity nor quality is comparably improved. This too is inflationary. This is, in fact, what inflation is: the creation of purchasing power, not offset by simultaneous creation of useful goods and services. Thus, $10 million worth of savings credit invested in building space missiles, for example, is permanently inflationary unless counteracted by increased taxes. The same $10 million used to build a furniture factory or to expand an airline may have a temporary inflationary effect initially only until the new facility produces sufficient net income to defray its costs of construction, normally a matter of 3 or 4 years at most. Thereafter, for an indefinite period, as it pours goods or services into the economy, its effect would tend to be beneficially deflationary. The consumer's dollar would purchase more without depriving the consumer of his source of purchasing power. Since the introduction of new plants into the economy as it expands is a continuous process, the long-term deflationary forces would more than offset the short-term inflationary forces. Such a second income economy would be free of the bloating of prices with costs that represent welfare rather than productive input. Even the initial and temporary inflationary tendency can be eliminated by the government's reducing its make-work subsidies by a portion of the amount invested in new capital. Question 2. Isn't the second income plan socialistic? Hardly. The second income plan builds ownership of the means of production into individuals as their private property. It then protects the right of each individual to receive all the wealth his property produces. This is a wide departure from what is popularly called socialism, where the capital is owned by the state and a broad income is sought through employment of one or more workers in every family and wages are set by the political apparatus. Since both the government's capital costs, usually reckoned by analogy to competitive economies, and the often artificially high labor costs are passed on to the consumer, the prices of goods and services are high. Incentive to produce, an important part of which is the acquisitive instinct or instinct to own capital, is low. By placing a main source of economic power in an industrial economy, namely, the ownership of capital in the government bureaucracy, where it is combined with their political power, the socialist economy tends toward totalitarianism. A second income economy, on the other hand, would put all economic power in individual hands and would bring about its wide diffusion. Thus, it would tend to be a power-diffused, hence free, society. So far in history, there has never been an economy in which every household owned a viable share of productive property, and this is the ideal of the second income plan. Question 3. Would not the financing of business expansion primarily by sale of newly issued stock to new or small stockholders dilute the equity of existing stockholders? No economic dilution would be involved. If General Motors, for example, expands its productive capacity 20% and finances this new capital by sale of new stock at market price to its employees or other buyers under second income financing, the equity of the existing stockholders is not diminished in the slightest. Each new share of stock issued results in investment of the proceeds in new productive plant and equipment. The pre-existing stockholders own exactly what they did before the expansion, namely, all the General Motors equity that existed up to the date of the new stock issue. For every dollar of new stock, a dollar's worth of new productive capital has been added. There is, however, a dilution of voting power, and this is a dilution that is intended. The great corporations of America, effectively owned by 2 million families, have a narrow voting control. The same corporations vastly expanded and owned by 65 million families would have a broad voting control. That is precisely what ought to be. Certainly from management's standpoint, The more broadly ownership is diffused, the better. The second income plan breaks up the monopoly access to new capital formation, now enjoyed by existing capital owners. But when you stop to think about it, why should those who own the economy's existing assets automatically acquire ownership of all future assets forever and ever? Why shouldn't private and individual ownership of the means of production be as widely diffused as the power to vote? The second income plan is intended to protect existing ownership against dilution. Indeed, by tightening up the laws of private property, it is designed to reduce dilution suffered by existing stockholders. But it is also intended to create tens of millions of new stockholding families as it brings about the building of the second economy. Question 4. Is there really enough corporate stock to provide every American family with a second income from dividends? There would be, given 25 years or so in which to do the job. The second income plan does not propose governmental redistribution of any of the existing stock ownership. Quite the contrary. The protection of both present and future private property and capital ownership is the essence of the plan. We are proposing that only newly issued stock be made available under the plan. This would be new capital created by industry as it expands its productive facilities to provide more goods and services to families with second incomes to spend. Currently, new capital formation in the American economy is taking place at a rate of about $60 billion a year. This is enough new capital to allocate about $4,000 worth to each of 15 million families each year, or $20,000 worth in 5 years. Incidentally, 15 million families are 1/4 of all the households in the USA, and almost all of the poorest ones. Question 5. Where does the money come from to buy the stock? You borrow it from a bank on a promissory non-recourse note, secured by pledging the stock itself. The bank can, if the rate of growth warrants, discount your note by turning it over to its Federal Reserve Bank in exchange for cash equal to the note's face value less the discount. The money to pay the bank comes directly from the Federal Reserve. It is new money issued against your promissory note. Except for the purpose involved, this banking procedure is conventional. Nothing new has been added. It is a rational system for monetizing carefully controlled new capital formation, the chief source of the goods and services that money buys. It would be the first rational monetary system in history. Question 6. Who decides what stocks you get? You do, within the limits of what is available among qualified stocks at the time you buy. It would depend on which corporations were seeking funds for expansion at that time. It is proposed that a monetary regulatory agency, Capital Diffusion Insurance Corporation, under proper statutory authorization, establish a qualification procedure whereby a corporation seeking to qualify its shares for finance purchase by new stockholders under the second income plan could, by conventional means, establish the financial feasibility of the proposed expansion. When qualified, the shares could be offered by the investment banking house for sale to new stock buyers who borrow funds through the banking system or from other lending sources. The financing bank would insist that the portfolio of stocks be suitably diversified. Question 7. What happens if, after you buy stock, you find that someone else's stock is doing a lot better? Almost every stockholder finds himself in this situation at one time or another. The second income plan can, after all, only offer equality of economic opportunity, no equality of income or exemption from ordinary investment risks. However, the very fact that corporations have qualified for insured loans on their stock would be important assurance that they were sound. Diversification offers further protection from the risk of faring too badly in comparison with other finance capitalists. When you select stocks for purchase under your second, third, and fourth capital financing loan, you can use your experience to upgrade your holdings if you have not chosen too well the first time around. Question 8. If families are allowed to buy capital without first working and saving for it, won't it corrupt them? Not unless you believe that every well-to-do family that has inherited all or some of its wealth is thereby corrupted. A list of families who did not work and save their way to capital ownership would have to include the families of most of America's founding fathers, many of our presidents, and disproportionately many of our most distinguished artists, scholars, writers, statesmen, public servants, and business leaders. The fact is that it is almost impossible for a man to contribute significantly to the work of civilization until he has provided his family with a minimum income that relieves him from having to toil for their living. Furthermore, the families do save to pay for their stock. The stocks produce dividends. Instead of spending these dividends, the family plows them back to pay off the loan. It is only as the stock is paid for that they begin to use the dividends as a second income. This procedure is exactly the same as that followed by business throughout the industrial era. Businessmen have always borrowed money to invest in productive capital and then let the earnings of the new capital pay off the loan. This is how our first families became first families. And what's proper for the first families of America is proper for all families, isn't it? Question 9. If a poor family winds up owning some $20,000 worth of stock, won't it squander it? A few might. But even as to profligates, the privilege of running through a capital estate should not be confined to those who already have one. But most new second income families will treasure their new capital estate and will husband it and hang on to it for dear life, just as a family a century ago would fight to the death to retain possession of its farm under the Homestead Act, just as our peasant ancestors went hungry rather than eat the last of their herds or flocks, and just as the most primitive agricultural tribes hoarded their seed corn throughout winter, even though many of them starved. The belief that the average man does not have the wisdom to preserve capital and the ability to use it constructively is not borne out by history. Moreover, inexperienced families can be taught a great deal about how to manage their capital estates during the time it takes for the dividends to pay off the loan. This would be a place where unions could make an invaluable educational contribution. So could benevolent societies, civic groups, and bank trust departments. A thoughtful economist, after studying the second income plan, expressed the opposite concern, and with some reason. He suggested that when the average citizen finds that the acquisition of productive capital by himself in quantities sufficient to provide a significant income is actually feasible, it will arouse in him, as it has so many times in history, a sharpened acquisitive instinct, and he may then seek to save so much of his income that his consumption may suffer. Here again, education must come to the rescue. The proper use and enjoyment of wealth is one of our least understood subjects. Question 10. Aren't you overestimating the earnings of mature corporation? If earnings are really 20% of invested capital, why are dividends today only about 5%? A 5% yield on invested capital is about the best that can be expected today. But this figure does not represent the stockholder's real equity in corporate earnings. The corporate income tax at the federal level alone takes 45% of earnings at source, and this level may return again to its recent higher levels. The state corporate income tax removes another 4 to 5%. Even prior to this, an incalculable part of the wealth produced by capital has been redistributed to employees through such devices as non-competitively determined or administered wages and welfare benefits. Add to this the earnings withheld by the corporation itself to finance expansion, often as much as half of what remains after taxes. A myriad of accounting practices, too, are employed to conceal much of the productivity of capital. So do such tax practices as excessive depreciation allowances and investment credits. As things are now, the stockholder does not receive more than a fraction of the wealth his capital actually produces. Under the second income plan, the full 20% or even higher yield would be paid out on stocks financed under the Plan 1's approved techniques. Note that this does not mean that all stocks will be subject to the full dividend payout principal. Stocks bought and sold in the conventional market would be unaffected by the second income plan. The annual survey of industry profits contained in the April issue of National City Bank's monthly economic letter has shown for years that the average net profit before taxes of more than 1 in 200 S corporations exceeds 20%, notwithstanding the universally used devices to conceal profits. Question 11. Won't the second income plan lead to more government interference instead of less? No, the government acts only as a supervisor of the credit system, which it is now, and as a referee to see that every American family gets a fair chance to buy and pay for a share of American industry. Once the plan gets underway, present government involvement in business and personal affairs could be cut way back. The source of most government interference today is the need to redistribute income and to artificially create unnecessary work on a massive scale in order to keep the economy from collapsing. From this need springs such things as make-work programs, subsidies, corporate income taxes, etc. Needless to say, the government would not have to fight an anti-poverty war when there are no more impoverished families. Of course, the present situation did not come into existence overnight, and we cannot change it overnight. However, we can change the tendency of events. The goal of the second income plan is to build privately owned economic security into each family rather than welfare into the society. Economically independent families mean economically independent villages, towns, and cities. Such communities can manage their own affairs and provide for their OM needs democratically at the local level. They do not have to risk impairment of their liberties in return for government benefits. A government does not have to do for its citizens those things the citizens can do for themselves. Hence, the tendency of the second income plan is toward less government interference, and less taxation. It most emphatically does not mean, however, a return to laissez-faire. The government must umpire the game, but the second income plan will provide the rules, and the economically independent citizen with an affluent second income is the goal. Question 12. If everybody gets an income from capital, who will do unpleasant work in the economy? First of all, let us remember that the immediate result of the second income plan will be genuine full employment. That is, jobs actually necessary to produce goods and services for people rather than non-economic space hardware and war goods. Then let us remember that even at growth rates double and triple the present 3 to 4%, the second economy to be owned by those not owning assets in the existing economy will take some years to build. Thus, for a few years, frankly, no one can predict just how many second incomes from capital ownership will supplement labor incomes, not replace them for the majority of families. Thus, the answer to the question of who will do the necessary work in the economy for the next generation or so is, many more of us than are working now. As technological advance eliminates the need for human labor in the economy, and this it will continue to do whether we adopt the second income plan or not, incomes from capital will gradually become primary sources of income instead of secondary. The economy will always need some labor, no matter how advanced the technology. But no one can predict just what labor's work will consist of after the second economy is built. Whether work will be fascinating or boring, delightful or disagreeable, require geniuses or morons, no one can say. The question as asked assumes that the work required 2 generations or so from now will be disagreeable, and that persons having incomes from capital will not be motivated to perform it. But the facts may be just the opposite. One thing is certain. With plenty of purchasing power around, the price of any work for which there is need in the economy will rise to the point where the work will be done. The question cannot be definitively answered today, and 20 years from now, perhaps it won't even be asked. Question 13. If mature corporations finance their growth through future savings, won't this destroy investment opportunities for those who have accumulated savings? Those who already own a capital estate may invest their excess in new capital formation, in the financing of the second income plan for others, and in enterprises that either do not utilize second income plan financing or do not qualify for it. These latter types of enterprise generally involve a higher investment risk than do mature corporations. They also yield larger rewards to the successful investor. Inasmuch as the social justification for accumulated savings has always been that their owners put them at risk in order to add to the productive assets of the economy, owners of substantial capital estates should not object to carrying out their self-proclaimed social duty. Moreover, the building of the second economy will open up hundreds or times more investment opportunities than exist today, opportunities for creative and profitable employment of capital. In the one-income economy, there is normally more capital available for investment than places to invest it, a frustrating situation for the capital owner, and one reason why existing stocks are bid up far beyond the level justified by actual dividend return. We must keep in mind, too, that second income plan financing is only an alternative method of finance. It is not meant to supplant the conventional techniques based on past savings, but to supplement them in order to make capital ownership possible for families without savings. Question 14. What effect would the second income plan have on the stock market? Gradually, stock prices would develop a direct relation to income, and the continual churning of existing outstanding stock would be reduced. Stocks would ultimately be bought primarily for their income yield, rather than in anticipation of speculative profits or for the purpose of avoiding normal income tax rates. The total volume of stocks outstanding would be multiplied dozens and dozens of times as the proportion of new capital formation financed by issuance of new stock rises from 4% as at present to ideally 100%. The normal and non-speculative market in stocks would thus vastly exceed in volume the most speculative and unhealthy booms of today's stock market. Question 15. How does the second income plan differ from the guaranteed income proposed by the ad hoc committee on the Triple Revolution? There is virtually no similarity, only differences. The second income plan is designed to enable every household to buy a viable share of the thing that produces affluence productive capital as its private property, to own, enjoy, increase, and pass on to its heirs. The guaranteed income is simply a super redistributive measure that makes each household's economic welfare dependent on political and bureaucratic decisions. The second income plan would diffuse economic power throughout all households in the society, thus building an economic foundation for political democracy and securing the rights and liberty of the individual. The guaranteed income proposal necessarily fuses in the hands of politicians economic power with political power, thereby tending to create a totalitarian system hostile to the rights of the individual. It is impossible for a citizen to retain his civil rights when others have the power to determine his material needs. The second income plan offers detailed and specific measures for bringing about tremendous economic growth of second economy, which will be capable of producing for the many the high level of affluence now enjoyed by only the upper 10% of families in the existing economy. Thus, the second income plan offers a blueprint for enlarging the economy's productive capacity in ways which build the power to consume simultaneously with the power to produce. It stimulates the economic motivation of the individual. The guaranteed income merely subdivides the wealth produced by the existing economy already too small to produce real affluence for the non-capital owning majority. Its basic mechanism is political redistribution of the wealth produced by capital. This weakens economic motivation and destroys the institution of private property and makes it unavailable to the many. Lastly, the second income plan encourages responsible government and the integrity of elected office holders. Imagine how our political institutions would degenerate if the main campaign issue became the size of the guaranteed annual income to be offered by the winning candidate or party. Question 16. How do we decide which American families will become finance capitalists first? Since the first aim of the second income plan is to provide equal economic opportunity to all Americans, logic and justice would demand that the first finance capitalists be households now totally or partially excluded from economic participation. Families whose breadwinners have been disemployed by automation, especially those men and women who have spent long years in the workforce. Elderly persons who have never earned enough from their labor to retire in comfort and dignity. Ministers, school teachers, and members of the civil service, policemen and firemen, and other municipal employees who have served a specified number of years in their posts. Working mothers of dependent children. Not everyone can go through a door at the same time, nor by the same token can everyone become a capitalist at once. The question of priority will have to be decided politically. But the finance capitalist door is strictly a one-way thoroughfare. Those families who pass through are on their way to material well-being and independence. It is also a door which grows wider and wider as policy becomes more and more oriented toward the objectives of the second income plan. And as families with second incomes increase, economic expansion will create more and more productive capital to be bought and paid for by new capital owners.